Hi, in this lecture, I'm going to present what Descartes does in the first meditation. To begin, let's remind ourselves what the aim of the meditations is. The aim is to establish a foundation for the sciences. So think here, physics, astronomy, those sorts of things. And we find a certain foundation when we find principles that cannot be doubted, cannot rationally be doubted. That's what we mean by certain. So we're going to come back to that notion of certainty in a few slides. And what I just said is that certainty amounts to not being able to be rationally doubted. So that notion of doubt is a crucial one. And in fact, some interpreters will describe Descartes as having a method of doubt, and that he uses methodological doubt. So the doubt there is not one that he really has, but rather it's just something that he uses for certain purposes. And the purpose there is to identify foundation for the sciences. So we're going to look at a variety of possible sources of knowledge, look at them one by one, and figure out, can this source of knowledge be trusted? So a source of potential knowledge. Can this one be trusted? Can this one be trusted? And we'll doubt them, we'll think critically about each of them, and many of them we'll find do not serve as a good foundation for the sciences. And so we rule those out, not to say that we can't trust them at all, ever again, but rather they don't serve the particular purpose that we have here, the purpose of being a foundation. So that's what we'll do in the rest of this lecture, is look at how Descartes evaluates possible sources of knowledge. The first possible source of knowledge is the senses. So here, this is relevant because a lot of our scientific knowledge comes from having senses. You observe how things are in the world with your eyes, but you also use other senses to learn about the world. So you touch things to see that they're hot or cold or what have you. And so you use your senses to learn about the world, it seems. But Descartes wants to know, are the senses something that can provide a foundation for all our knowledge? So he will readily admit that the senses give us knowledge, but do they work as providing a foundation? And that's what he disagrees with. His first argument against the senses is based on the recognition that the senses are sometimes deceptive. And what we should think about there is things like optical illusions. Something could look one way, but the way it appears to you, the way it seems to you, is not really the way it is. And what happens in illusions is that your faculty, like a faculty of sight in an optical illusion, is working just fine. But it's giving you information that is incorrect. Descartes gives a variety of examples about how the senses can deceive, but it should be obvious from our ordinary everyday life that this is true. But he uses that obvious thought to argue that the senses cannot be the source of our knowledge, cannot be the ultimate source of our knowledge, a foundation. And this is because he relies on a certain sort of principle. The principle is that if the senses sometimes are deceptive, then they are not fully reliable. That is to say, they don't give you certainty. And so his conclusion here is that we ought not trust completely or fully the senses. When we get done with all the meditations, he'll say, yeah, we should use the senses. We sometimes should trust them. But we need some way to figure out when to trust the senses and when not to. And that's got to be something besides the senses that tells you when to trust them. So the senses aren't the final foundation for our knowledge. Rather, we need something else to evaluate the senses. And so once we have that, then we'll know when to trust the senses and when not to. So what we need to do now is try to find what this other thing is. But before we resume that inquiry, let's clarify a little bit about what Descartes is doing when he doubts the senses. First, the word doubt can mean a variety of things. Sometimes when you doubt something, you think that that thing that you're doubting is false. But sometimes doubt can mean withholding judgment, withholding assent, withholding your belief, not wanting to say one way or the other. And that's more like what Descartes is doing here. He's doubting in the sense that he's reserving judgment about what he's doubting. But he's reserving or withholding judgment in a particular way. He's using what we can call critical doubt. Critical doubt is withholding assent, withholding judgment, because you recognize that there is not enough justification, not enough reasons to believe the thing that's being doubted. So what this means is that using critical doubt, we're examining the foundations of what we believe. We're examining our justification, our reasons, evidence, or support. And why we're doing that is because we're looking for rational certainty. So this is another term that we can introduce that Descartes doesn't use, but helps clarify what he's after. So certainty, just like doubt, is a word that can mean a variety of things. Many instances, what we mean by certainty is a certain sort of feeling. You feel certain, you cannot help but believe something because you have this feeling. That's not what Descartes is after. Rather, Descartes is after rational certainty. Rational certainty is not a feeling, but rather it's the result of a logical analysis, a result of looking at justification for various beliefs and realizing that something has to be true. Something must be true because it's immune from any rational doubts. So you might try to doubt something in as many ways as possible. You'll try to figure out why the possible justification might not work. But if you use critical doubt as much as you can, and the result of that process, you cannot find that the justification is insufficient, but rather what you're possibly doubting has to be true no matter what, then it's a rational certainty. And that's what Descartes is looking for. Now, these notions of critical doubt and rational certainty will help us particularly in the coming arguments. The first of those arguments concerns dreaming. So in the previous thing that Descartes had done was to say that the senses cannot be completely trusted, that there are some instances where we shouldn't trust the senses. But this argument's aim is to show that we shouldn't trust the senses at all. The previous argument said sometimes don't trust the senses. This one says never trust the senses. And Descartes' argument relies on the point that even perceptions made in ideal conditions, so there's not an optical illusion going on, even those sorts of things are indistinguishable from vivid dreams. That not necessarily all your dreams, but at least some dreams can be completely vivid, completely lifelike to match what you get in ordinary experience. And if that's so, then you shouldn't trust the senses at all. So let's consider this argument in a little bit more formal way. So here I use an abbreviation. The letter S, capital letter S, means any proposition based on the senses. So it's a variable standing in for anything that you might believe because you see it, hear it, taste it, and so on. So if I believe right now there's a cat in the room, or I believe it's dark outside, those are different things that I believe on the basis of my senses. And so take any one of those sorts of things, and this is what we get with the argument. If, and that's important, if I know S, so any proposition that I think I know from the senses, if I know it, then I know that I'm not dreaming that thing. So if I know there's a cat in the room right now, if I know that, then I have to be able to rule out the possibility that I'm just dreaming it. So this is what Descartes is doing in using rational doubt and looking for rational certainty. To know something means that you have to be able to rule out all possibility that it's false. However remote the possibility might seem, you have 100% certainty only if you can rule out all possible alternatives. So I know that there's a cat in this room only if I can show or prove in some way that I'm not just dreaming that there's a cat in this room. So that's sort of a general principle about what's required to have certainty, 100% certainty, and hence knowledge. Now, the second principle basically says, I don't have that sort of certainty. I don't know that I'm not just dreaming that there's a cat in this room, or whatever the proposition that I have based on the senses is, because I cannot rule out that possibility that I'm just having a really vivid dream right now. After all, I lied down on the sofa earlier today, or at least I think I did, and maybe I just kept having dreams. I had a dream about waking up and dream about coming to the computer to record this lecture. And maybe that's all that's happening here, is that I'm just having a vivid dream that's continuing on. Descartes' point here is not that all dreams are vivid and totally lifelike. It's not that some dreams are vivid and totally lifelike. It's rather that dreams could be lifelike, could be totally lifelike. Descartes' point here is that what dreams are made of, various sensations, feelings, sights, and so on, is the same stuff that what we take to be ordinary experience, what that's made of. It's the same kinds of stuff, the same types of sensations. Now, it often will be that, it seems like it's just a difference in degree. What we have in real life is much more vivid sensation than what happens in dreaming. But ultimately, Descartes' point is that it's the same kind of stuff. And if it's the same kind of stuff, then it's really hard to rule out the possibility at any given instant that we're just dreaming. And if that's so, then it seems that we can't trust anything that we know through the senses because it could be the result of dreaming. And we don't have a reason yet to rule out the possibility that we're dreaming. Now, once again, Descartes is just using critical doubt. Ultimately, he's going to come to say, we know stuff in ordinary life. You know that you're not dreaming. But here, he's doubting that in order to find a basis for figuring out what we can know through the senses or not. So what we've done so far is rule out the senses as a possible source of knowledge. But there's a different source of knowledge, and that's what we have through reasoning that's not dependent on the senses. And the paradigm here of that kind of knowledge is mathematics. Knowing an arithmetical truth like 5 plus 7 equals 12 doesn't seem to depend on the senses. You don't need to actually have a sight of 5 things, a sight of 7 things, and do an experiment to figure out putting the 5 things and the 7 things together, that'll give you 12. You don't need to do an experiment, rather you reason it through in your head. So Descartes, at this point in the first meditation, says that, even if I'm dreaming, it seems like I can know what he says are more simple and universal things. And I suggest what he means there is things like mathematics. 5 plus 7 equals 12, a certain sort of universal truth, and it's made up of simple notions like 5 plus 7 equals 12. So at this stage, it seems like, this is immune from the dreaming argument. This is immune from doubt that we have so far. Mathematics cannot be doubted in the same way that the senses were doubted. It's at this point that Descartes gives his famous argument that there might be an evil demon or genius that deceives you when you think about mathematical things. So when we think about this evil demon or evil genius, it's important to note that it's just a mere device. Descartes doesn't think this sort of thing really exists, but he's positing its existence here to serve a certain function, which is to figure out what can be trusted with 100% certainty. So what is all this about? Well, basically he says, I have this idea of God, and I can sort of imagine a God that's just as powerful, but not as good. So someone that could have it out for me, someone that would want me to be deceived because they have bad intentions, and they also have the means to deceive me. So this evil demon decides every time I perform a mathematical calculation, I'll get it wrong. I'll maybe lose some memories, lose track of what I've been doing. So for example, when I try to calculate 5 plus 7 equals 12, this evil demon will decide, okay, I'm going to trip you up. I'm going to have you forget certain steps you made. I'm going to have you forget that you were thinking about 5 and have you start thinking about 4. And sort of trip our memories up, trip our faculties up from operating correctly. And so that we end up making mistakes when it comes to figuring out what's true in mathematics. So that's the evil demon or evil genius hypothesis. And we can use that hypothesis to offer an argument that's similar to the one about dreaming. Once again, we have a variable, capital letter M, meaning any proposition concerning mathematics. And once again, you know something in mathematics only if you can rule out any possibility that you're mistaken. So one possibility that you're mistaken is that there's an evil genius that always has it out for you. So if you know 5 plus 7 equals 12, you only know it if you can also know that there is no evil demon that's tricking you about that thing that you presume to be true. So that first premise, as in the dreaming argument, relies on the thought that knowledge and 100% certainty requires that you be able to rule out all possible alternative ways that things could go. Now the second premise says, I cannot know that there's not an evil genius. Because there's some possibility about it, it seems like it's a coherent scenario, maybe it seems unlikely, but I don't have any reason for thinking it's impossible. There's no possibility whatsoever that there's such an evil demon. Therefore, if you take these two premises together, it seems that I don't have knowledge of mathematics, just as it seems that I don't have knowledge coming from the senses. So let's conclude our look at the first meditation here. So far, what Descartes has done is identified a few possible sources of knowledge. Knowledge might come from the senses, or it might come from reasoning of the sort that we do in mathematics. But each one of these possible sources of knowledge is not immune from critical doubt. And so we have this worry that they might not be trustworthy, and for Descartes' purposes, that means that we should discard them because they're not going to provide that foundation that we use to figure out when to trust the senses and when not, when to trust our manner of calculating mathematical truths and when not. Now, this is just a preliminary step. Ultimately, Descartes thinks that he will find such a foundation, but he hasn't yet found it. And so, in order to find that foundation, he says at the end of the first meditation, he needs to assume that there's an evil demon. Just assume that there is one, and could there be anything that we know despite the evil demon's attempts to trick us?